The following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
I am back, and you are comfortably zoned with me, the Zigzag Man, in Alameda, California, right across the bay from San Francisco in the northern part of California. As you may or may not know, ladies and gentlemen, I am in the midst of producing a syndicated radio show, and I guess if I have a linguist with us, I should say a syndicated radio show. David Hubler is here. David Hubler is a regular with the Bronx Roots podcast show on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network, and will be a big part of Comfortably Zoned in a Vat of Pine Tar. It's going to be syndicated on Sports. Oh, my God. David, you got to help me here.
Write it down. I do. I mean, you
Sports Byline Daily, ladies
right.
and gentlemen. And we're going to be on once a week. We're on 200 different affiliates, including Armed Forces Radio and XM Sirius. If you fly United and you plug the thing in, you'll hear our dulcet tones on Comfortably Zoned in a Vat of Pine Tar.
At 35,000 feet.
Can you imagine? Can you get us a bag, stewardess? We seem to be getting sick. Everybody's getting sick, and it's your voice. So you can imagine that. David, I'm excited. The segment that you're going to be involved in the show is entitled Wartime Baseball. We're going to give folks an idea of what it was like to be a baseball fan in 1942 with the prospect of the season being ended. And David, you wrote a book called Nats and Grays. It covers that time in our history. Tell us, if you would, how close we actually came to being closed down, how close baseball came to not being a reality in those years.
Yes, well, of course, Pearl Harbor occurred on the very same weekend that the Major League owners were meeting in Chicago and planning the 1942 season. At the moment that happened,
I'm back.
George,
hey,
David, how are you, George?
Hi.
Yeah. Okay, sorry about that. My wife had a problem I had to help her with, so now we're okay. So
hey,
I didn't mean to interrupt you guys. Go ahead.
That's a microcosm of all three of our lives.
Yeah, right.
For 50 some odd years.
Hey.
You guys have been lucky enough to keep it with the same wife. But the wives can be a problem, and a pleasant one at that.
Well, I'm so technically proficient. I knew exactly what the problem was.
Oh.
we had a problem with the computer, and I had to hit it a few times, and now it's okay.
Just smack it upside the head like I did.
That's it. That's what I did.
All right. I introduced David as the co-host of the segment that we're going to have on Comfortably Zoned in a Vat of Pine Tar, the syndicated show that we're having on Sports Byline USA. And George is the co-host. The segment is entitled Wartime Baseball, and George's dad was a major league player during those years. So David is in the midst of telling us how close baseball came to being shut down, and we interrupted him during Pearl Harbor. He tells us the baseball meetings were on to plan the 42 season, and what happened?
Well, they took a page out of World War I when the same problem arose, even though it was It turned out to be only for a year and a half or so, but they decided to continue playing. And the motivation for this was, strangely enough, a letter from Roosevelt's biggest antagonist, the commissioner of baseball, Mountain Landis, to asking what we should do about the coming season. And even though the two hated each other, Roosevelt replied back saying, no, keep the game going because it's a good morale booster. That response became known as the Green Light Letter. So the 16 teams at the time went ahead and made preparations for the new season, despite the fact that they knew they would be losing some players. A number of the stars, several of whom actually signed right up for the draft within days of Roosevelt's famous Pearl Harbor speech before Congress.
I think Bob Feller was among those.
Yes, he was.
Yes, he was. Feller was. Yes.
Feller and who else?
Well, Hank Greenberg re-enlisted. Yeah. Hank Greenberg had been discharged, and right after Pearl Harbor, Greenberg, re-enlisted, and then, he served in, I guess 2 or 3 years, just like Feller, during the war. And, I don't mean to jump in there, David, but,
That's fine.
My dad knew Hank and knew Bob both because, playing against them. And then in 46, after the war was over, Feller came back, and my dad was a teammate of his with Cleveland. So, he had an intimate knowledge of both of those guys, plus, Clark Griffith. And you and I have talked before, we don't know for sure, but we think that Clark Griffith might have been the writer of the letter that went from FDR to Judge Landis about the continuation, the so-called Green Light Letter, because of the fact that FDR and Clark Griffith were very close, and Griffith made, trips to the White House often, and they were quite friendly.
In addition to which, Griffith had been a big sponsor of morale in the First World War, having donated bats and balls and gloves and things to the doughboys so that they could use it as for amusement when they weren't going off to France. He did the same thing in World War II as well. In fact, the first shipment was torpedoed by the Germans.
Okay. May I ask you guys both a little something about Judge Landis? He's one of the least known about characters in baseball history. Was he a judge before becoming a commissioner, an actual judge, or was that like a nickname?
That's a good question. David, maybe I don't know. To me, it's always been Judge Landis. So, he might have been a judge. I mean, he was named Kennesaw after where he was born in Kennesaw Mountain, Georgia. But whether he was an actual judge, I can't tell you that. But, his reputation did come when he was hired as a commissioner during the Black Sox scandal in 1919, that he was going to clean it up. So, whether or not his background was judicial, I really don't know.
Well, actually, he did. He was a jurist. He served as a federal judge in the early years of the 20th century, and became commissioner. I guess, let's see, the Black Sox scandal was 1919.
Right.
Yeah. So soon thereafter, he was named commissioner of baseball, the first person to hold that title, and he made the most of it. He was, you might say, dictatorial in many respects. He was from the Midwest and from Ohio, and he was a staunch Republican. So, of course, right off the bat, he didn't get on with Roosevelt, a staunch Democrat. But their exchange, and you're right, George. I do think, and I mentioned this, I write this in the Nats and the Grays, that I believe that Roosevelt handed off the letter to Griffith and said, "You answer the old SOB," and because Griffith was very much in favor, of course, of continuing the game, and he also suggested extending the number of night games that were just beginning to come in to baseball, and he was a big proponent of that. One of the first. Cincinnati had been the first team to put the game on the lights. But the point was he plugged that in the letter, and that was one of the clues to me that Roosevelt did not write the letter, I think, but he did write it in FDR style, in the sense that he talked about it being good for morale and that it would work for the GIs as well.
Right. No, it's very good points, David. That is absolutely correct. And that thing about the night games might be, an indication that it was Griffith that did write it, because at first Griffith was opposed to night games until it was pointed out to him, Mr. Griffith, this is extra opportunity for income for you, because the fact that you'll be at nights, the attendance will be picked up and all that kind of stuff. So I think you're right, David. That little paragraph in the green light letter, I think, is an indication as to who was actually the author of the letter. And then Roosevelt, signed his name, and it went off. And as you mentioned, the nickname of it is called the Green Light Letter of 1942.
Yeah. In fact, it was funny in a sense, because Griffith had gone public with a statement that baseball is a game that should be played under God's blue skies, something to that effect. And then suddenly he's turning around and he's telling the commissioner of baseball to play more night games. And it did turn out that it was a real boon to his bottom line to play those night games, because as Washington filled up with GIs and expanded federal programs, and the area was flooded with new federal employees as well, those night games were gold. People were able to go to these games. You're thinking the war years, travel was more difficult because of the travel restrictions on gasoline and things like that. So having Griffith Stadium right there was a wonderful opportunity for Griffith to really increase his bottom line.
Interesting. You could only have a night game during the war here. You couldn't have it in Europe with the blackouts.
Well, you know what they did? You mentioned the blackouts. One of the things that I forget which federal office, or maybe it was the War Department, probably the War Department, had gone around. There were several ballparks that were not allowed to turn on lights at night because they were close to the U.S. coastline, and they felt that the lights would backlight the better part of the city, and German subs off the coast of Long Island and places like that would have an opportunity to target the cities. And so Yankee Stadium did not have lights, but Ebbets Field did. And being in Brooklyn, along the edge of the water there, they could not use their lights for a while. And I think the Polo Grounds may have had. I'm not 100% certain about the Polo Grounds, but they were further inland. They were on the edge of the Harlem River. But the subs, as far as I know, the subs never got into the Harlem River. No,
they were too smart to go in the Harlem River.
Well, you know what else is interesting about that, and David, and Ralph, I took a look. By 1944, Washington played 44 night games. So, at home. So, it had a direct impact upon the fact that Washington and Clark Griffith, they had the night games and doubleheaders, as Dave was talking about, with regard to travel restrictions, because both events were something that it was new for night baseball, but doubleheaders were a common occurrence, which today, are very rare, if any, that are regularly scheduled.
And talk about rare. there was a very interesting, I heard it only once. I have no idea. It's probably in the Smithsonian. But, most people have heard Lou Gehrig's voice only from the time he made his farewell speech at Yankee Stadium. But Gehrig was interviewed, I think on a Chicago or a Cleveland radio station when the team was in that city, and I guess they had a day off or whatever, and they were interviewed by a sports reporter on the air. And Gehrig was pretty adamant, not in an angry way, but he was pretty sure that after the war was over, there would be no night baseball. They would revert back to the day game, which I thought was a really interesting comment, especially since it was such a rare actuality of him on the radio.
Yeah, you know what, David? That's interesting. I've never heard that before, and that really is surprising to me. I mean, I can understand Lou saying that. Of course, it was 5 years, later. But the fact is, I did not think about there was any kind of provision for, going back to day games after the war. I never heard that.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, he died in 41, so it was even before they started. But from 35 on, Major League Baseball began touring, with Cincinnati being the first to put the lights up.
Hey, if you guys don't mind, let me plug a book about Lou Gehrig by a fellow by the name of Tony Castro, who's been on this network, and he told me a number of things that I had, from his writings and his research, I had no idea about Lou Gehrig. For one, he was aware, it wasn't hidden from him, he was aware of what they called infantile paralysis. They thought it was a special kind of infantile paralysis, but he was aware of the morbidity of what was going on. It's a great book, and I'm just plugging it unabashedly. He wrote. Tony wrote a book called DiMaggio and Mick, and I read that, and his writings are terrific. So if you're out there and looking for some reading material that isn't the Nats and the Grays, try Tony's book about Lou Gehrig. Let me ask you, the Nats and the Grays, I got you here, and the question comes to mind simultaneously, David Hubler. Did the Nats and the Grays ever play exhibition games against each other or scrimmage against each other? They shared the same ballpark. I know it was when they were supposedly on the road, this, that, and the other thing. I'd like to know their skill levels when they played each other, if they did.
They really did not, and the commissioner banned that sort of thing. He was, in addition to being a right winger, he was also pretty much of a racist, as were many people in that era, and he did not want the racists mixing on the ball field. But the level of play in the Negro leagues was such a high level that Washington particularly was under extreme pressure from the Negro press, the African American newspaper chain, to bring in some of the Negro League stars, simply because in one respect, the teams that were put on the field, for the most part, had lost a number of the major draws, like DiMaggio, Ted Williams, Feller, players like that. And the editors of the Negro League, of the Negro publications, the African American in particular, were you've got these great ball players here. Why aren't you using them? And Griffith, who was under pressure, and in fact, because of this, a lot of people come to the conclusion that he was a racist because he did not bring any of these. The Grays, the Homestead Grays, which was a team based in the Pittsburgh area that began to play many of its weekend games in Washington when the Senators / Nationals were out of town, and Washington became a hotbed for Negro League baseball too, and the irony is that for those years, the Grays were the better team, no question about it, and drew very well.
Okay, was he afraid to go up, Griffith, afraid to go up against the powers that be, or, in your opinion, was he a racist?
No. He was not a racist. He was a businessman. Now, it may sound like an excuse, but it really wasn't, because he was making baseball was Griffith's only business. He was not into electronics like the Westinghouse brothers in Cincinnati or the beer moguls in St. Louis. So baseball was his only source of income. And it was not a big dollar market at that time, especially during the war. So Griffiths found that he was getting rent from the Grays, and they would help subsidize the costs of his white ball club, which is what it was. It was an all-white ball club. So a lot of people have thought he was a racist. Now, his
I
nephew,
thought he wasn't, because
no, he wasn't. You're right.
Connection later on, I don't think there were a lot of dark-skinned Cuban players coming up in the Washington chain. So, would you concur with that, George? Your dad played for him?
No, I do. I was going to say that. Yes, I do. I agree with David. You know, I never heard any talk from my dad or anybody that I knew, you know, Mickey or Cecil or Buddy Lewis, Dan Sand, any of those guys, about Clark Griffith being a racist. I mean, I've always maintained, as David said, it was an economic decision, and that if Clark Griffith had signed, Josh Gibson and Cool Papa Bell, whatever, that he would have lost a certain amount of attendance from the Negro League, because that's what the players, they came out to see those guys. And I think it was an economic decision more than anything else. You know, Mr. Griffith, later, you know, he was not the last one, but there were other ones, and of course, not too long after that, you know, Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier. So it wasn't that many years later, but on the other hand, my personal opinion is that it was an economic decision that he made not to sign anybody with the Grays for the Washington Ball Club, because he knew it was going to hurt the attendance of the Grays. And when you look at, as a matter of fact, if you look at history, a year or two after Jackie Robinson, I'm not sure whether it was a year or two, maybe 5 years after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, the Negro League ceased to exist.
Right. And 51, 52, somewhere on the line. When I was researching the Nats and the Grays, I spoke with Ted Levengood, who had written a biography called Clark Griffith, the Old Fox of Washington Baseball. And Ted was adamant too. And in fact, he was reading over parts of my manuscript, and at that time I was ambivalent as to whether he was a racist or not. And Ted said, "Look, I won't even give you a blurb unless you change that. He was not a racist at all." And as he makes a point in his book, and then of course I did in mine too, that Griffith was not. Now his nephew, who inherited the team, he was a racist.
Yeah, that's a different Griffith. That's Calvin. That's not
Calvin.
Clark.
That's right. And he's the one who moved him to Minneapolis, St. Paul.
Right, and said something about, well, you know, Minnesota has only 15,000 blacks or something like that in the whole state. So, you know, I knew Clark Griffith and I knew Calvin, and I can only tell you that I would attribute Calvin as being racist, but not Clark. And people have been confused. I've heard them say the name Griffith, and they automatically think about, you know, Calvin being racist, and they think they're talking about Clark, but they're two different people.
Yeah.
Clark Griffith was the adopted father of Calvin Griffith. Calvin Griffith's his given name was Calvin Robertson. He was a Robertson, but he changed his name to Griffith. But he was not a blood relative of Clark Griffith. He was an adopted son.
Yeah, it was Clark Griffith's wife's brother who is the father of Clark Griffith.
Right.
And
also that's Sherry Peterson.
Sherry Robertson. It was Sherry Robertson, Billy Robertson. They were all Calvin's brothers, who then were employed by Washington. Sherry as a player, Billy as an executive. But it was a family business, and that's what they were. So their name was Robertson. Calvin Griffith's, initial, his Canadian-born name was Calvin Robertson. When he was legally adopted by Clark Griffith, he changed the name to Griffith.
Yeah, he and his sister were adopted by Clark Griffith and his wife.
Right.
That family was destitute up there in Canada, and she came back and said, "Look, we have to do something about it." He had about 6 kids. He couldn't work. It was just an awful situation. So the Griffiths adopted the 2.
Took them in.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And then isn't it true, George? You would know. Calvin's the Clark Griffiths, the 2 adopted. The daughter, didn't she marry Tom Yorkie?
She married Joe Cronin.
Joe Cronin, that's right.
And Joe Cronin, was Clark Griffith's son-in-law in 1934. After they won the pennant in 33, 34 they didn't, and then Clark Griffith sold and traded Joe Cronin, his son-in-law, to the Boston Red Sox for $225,000 plus a player named Lynn Larry. And people would say, Lynn Larry, my God, compared Lynn Larry to Joe Cronin. But on the other hand, as we talked about it being an economic decision, $225,000 was a huge amount of money back then for Clark Griffith on his bottom line.
Yes, yeah, you're right. Mm-hmm.
Was Lynn Larry Frank Larry's brother?
I wouldn't think so.
That I don't know, Ralph. I really don't know. I mean, they
Frank
would have been
Larry came along a good bit later. Frank.
I was going to say there's been a long time. Maybe there was some kind of an uncle relationship or father-son.
Father-son.
I don't know, but there was at least I think 20 years separating the 2.
Okay, one other question for you guys. Stars leaving all teams. Rosters needed to be filled out. Was it a free-for-all? Was it, did certain teams, I remember one of the Wainers came back to play during the war. They had been retired from Pittsburgh. And I'm wondering, was there a draft? Did teams own rights to players who had been retired and they had to settle it with the new teams? How did that go down?
George, you're up.
Well, I wish I could tell you that. I really don't know. There is a book. You're talking about, you talked about the Lou Gehrig book. There is a book, and I've read it, and I don't have it in front of me, but it's called Replacement Players of World War II. Now, whether or not they were drafted or whether or not they tried out, I don't know. But I do know that the major league clubs were really desperate for players. They had to find players, and that's why somebody like a Pete Gray with one arm, was playing with the St. Louis Browns because they needed bodies on the field. And the caliber of play is certainly not what it was before that. But on the other hand, some of these guys were doing the best they could. But the book I'm referring to, a guy sent it to me, and he said, "Oh, my claim to fame is my father or somebody raced against your father in some kind of a promotion, and your dad beat him. But my father always said, well, I lost to the fastest man in baseball." So, that's all I know about the replacement players. I don't know how it worked, but I do know that the teams had to fill up their roster. And, they might have had, Washington might have had, 25 players on the roster. Maybe 5 or 10 of them had gone into service. So they had to bring in another 10 or 15 players to fill up their spots.
Yeah, and what's not known generally, even among baseball fans, talking about the war years, is that the minor leagues were hurt much worse than the major leagues, because you had 18, 19, sometimes 17-year-old kids, and they were susceptible to the draft right away. I'm talking about the war draft, not there was no baseball draft in those days. So the minor leagues were decimated, and the major leagues. One of the classic stories I tell in the book about how at one point in the year, Clark Griffith, who actually acted as his own general manager, a number of the owners did that before general managers became a regular job. He worked out a deal. There was a ball player in New York who was working for the New York City Sanitation Department, and he was reluctant to leave his job to play Major League Baseball because he was afraid he would lose his pension. Even though they only wanted him for about 2 months or 3 months to end the season. So Clark Griffith, who was a master manipulator, in addition to everything else, went right to the source. He went right to Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia, the famous wartime mayor of New York, and they worked out a deal that allowed this ball player, garbage collector, to come down to Washington and play baseball with the team for the rest of the season on some kind of leave program, so he could go back when the season was over, back to his job with the New York City Sanitation Department, and would not lose his pension.
That was a great story.
Isn't that a wonderful?
Yeah, that was a great story, David. David, I remember reading that in your book, and I had never heard it until I read it, and I thought it was a wonderful story because it was really indicative of what had to be done. As I said earlier, they had to fill up their roster spots, and to be able to do that, Mr. Griffith had to come up with some kind of a solution to give this guy, playing time, but not to affect his employment status.
Yeah, and in some cases what they did was, with an agreement with Major League, some of the older ball players who were a bit past their prime and were working in defense industries were allowed to play for let's say you worked in a defense plant in Detroit. You could play for the Tigers on a weekend basis when you weren't working in the defense plant. A number of ball players did that. So they had all these sort of ways to sort of supplement the roster.
George, your dad was a wartime player, 4F, working in the defense plant. Can you tell stories about that?
Well, the stories about it was that my dad was declared 4F because he had a shoulder separation. So he went to the draft board 3 or 4 different times and was turned down each time. And the deal was that, he was healthy enough to play, which sounds crazy, but he was healthy enough to play, but not healthy enough to be a soldier. But on the other hand, part of the agreement, and what David was talking about with the green light letter, part of the agreement with Major League Baseball was that any player who was designated 4F would work in the defense industry during the off season. And my dad, being in the off season, it was not that he was playing weekends. He was actually working in the defense industry in Trenton, New Jersey, building Avenger torpedo bombers. And then, once the spring training started, then he would be allowed to leave his defense industry job and go to spring training. Well, part of spring training, as David also talked about, was the fact is that during the war there were travel restrictions. So my dad only had to go from Trenton, New Jersey to College Park, Maryland, because that's where the senators were forced to train because of travel restrictions. They couldn't go to Florida. So, it wasn't that long a distance. So he was in Trenton working in 43, 44, 45 during the off season at that defense plant, and then playing Major League Baseball in the spring and summer.
And another thing that Clark Griffith lucked out on was the location of his team in Washington, because during the war, the service teams were excellent teams. They had major league ball players on a number of them, and several of them were around the D.C. area. So Washington played these teams at various posts and bases. They even were able, because the travel restrictions didn't apply to taking a cruise down the Potomac River to the Norfolk base, where there was a wonderful team, two teams actually, down at Norfolk Naval Station, who gave Washington a good run for its money in spring training games.
Well, they sure did. Those teams there were two. There were the Norfolk teams, and then Great Lakes. They were the two, major, service places where an awful lot of. Matter of fact, Bill Dickey was, I think, head of the recruiting or something for Great Lakes Naval Air Station. So, that and Norfolk, and what David is saying is exactly right. The players look forward to it because they took a boat ride down the Potomac to Norfolk to play against the Norfolk team. And as David was saying, they did the Norfolk team. I mean, wartime baseball, those teams were stocked with a lot of terrific ball players. I've seen players in uniform that were, major league players, great stars, wearing the uniform of either Norfolk or Great Lakes during the war.
And those guys saw combat duty later on. They get
some of them did. Yes, they did.
A lot of them did, and some of them get a bad rap. They were just in the service to play baseball. A lot of them.
Oh, Buddy Lewis from Washington. He flew about
Buddy Lewis, right? Buddy Lewis flew the hump in Burma. Cecil Travis had his feet frozen in Battle of the Bulge. Bob Feller was an anti-aircraft gunner on the USS Alabama battleship. And Hank Greenberg was a forward spotter in the Army Air Force. So I mean, they didn't have.
And Ted Williams trained pilots.
And Ted Williams, right? Ted Williams was a flight instructor for the Marines.
Jerry Coleman was a flyer, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. Yes, he was. Yeah.
Yep.
So, I mean, these guys really did serve. And Buddy Lewis, wonderful. He flew over 300 missions over the hump, which was one of the most dangerous trips you could make. And he had one time he had a congressional VIP with him on the plane, and apparently they came back, and the VIP told the press, they asked him what was it like. He said all he did was talk baseball the whole trip. As he piloted this plane into China back and forth.
Well, it's interesting. I'll tell you one quick story about Buddy Lewis and my dad. Buddy Lewis had been in he was flying some VIPs into Washington, so he flew them in to Andrews or wherever it was, and he stopped by the ballpark, and the players were so happy to see him. And Buddy said, now look, when I leave, I'm going to fly over Griffith Stadium, and it's me, because I'm going to go low and slow in a DC-3. And my dad was on deck, and he said, all of a sudden, out of center field, here's this big lumbering plane flying over the ballpark, dips his wings. My dad throws his bat up in the air and says, hey, buddy, we know it's you. And that was the last time they saw him for another 2 years as he was, completing his service obligations, as David talked about, flying the hump in Burma.
Great story. I love it.
That is a great story. Would you guys, off the subject just a little bit, but a call back to the name Pete Gray. I know the level of play in wartime baseball was lower, considerably lower than it was traditionally before and after, of course, especially after with integration. But aside that, does Pete Gray, because he had one arm and he was brought in, does that give the entire era, the wartime era, kind of lower it in people's minds just because of that one player, Pete Gray? Well, they had Pete Gray. Well, he was just one guy. There were 16 teams and 25 players. Do you think that the public perception of wartime baseball was affected because of Pete Gray's existence. David.
Oh, okay. Yes, it was because they made a movie about him and stuff. But Washington had Bert Shepard, who had lost a leg in combat, and all he wanted to do was get back and make the major leagues. His story was far more, I think, heroic than the Pete Gray story. I forget who even played Pete Gray in the movie, but I don't remember there ever being a movie made about Bert Shepard. Shepard actually did make it on the Washington roster. They brought him in. First of all, he had lost his leg. He was a pitcher, and it was his right leg, I believe, right, George? The leg that
right.
So as a pitcher, it wasn't his landing leg.
Right. It was his push-off leg, right?
Yeah, it was his push-off leg off the rubber. So it was to his benefit rather than have to land on a wooden leg.
Right.
Anyway,
right.
He finally made it. He made it into one game actually, and he did rather well. While the story of of Bert Shepard isn't as well known, what it did do at that time, and we've talked a bit about this just earlier, it created an uproar among the African American press, which had been militating, as I said, for integration of baseball because they had all these wonderful black ball players who were really capable of making the majors. But when Griffith brought in a one-legged pitcher, it did set off, because instead of actually going to healthy black ball players, they brought in Bert Shepard, and that seemed to be the last straw as far as the Negro press was concerned. But interestingly enough, he pitched quite well. He pitched about 5 innings in relief. He gave up, I think, 1 run. And Griffith did it not as a publicity stunt, but he did it as a morale booster. He'd been urged to do it by the man who was an assistant secretary of state and had met Shepard in the hospital, and all Shepard would do talk about how he wanted to get back and play Major League Baseball.
Right, and Bert Shepard had been brought in by Ozzie Bluege, who was the manager then, as a batting practice pitcher. And, Ozzie felt that he had the tools to try it, and he did. And what David's saying, he came in, performed very well. But the other thing that Bert Shepard did, and a lot of people, and David, I think you probably talked about it in your book, was that, the closeness to Walter Reed Hospital, Bert Shepard made a lot of visits to Walter Reed as a morale boost, what David was talking about, to the servicemen, saying, hey, look, guys, I know you've been wounded. I know you're not in the best of shape, but here I am. I was wounded just like you. I lost my leg, and I was able to, through perseverance and grit, make it to the major leagues. The fact is he pitched 1 game, but he was on a major league roster. And, I've got a signed baseball with his name on. My dad and Bert Shepard were very good friends. And matter of fact, at one point I had a photograph of Bert Shepard in the plane that he was shot down over Germany. And the fact is that his life was saved by a German doctor when they amputated, and then they repatriated him back to the United States. So, I feel like David does. I mean, the fact is that Pete Gray had a lot of publicity because he was one arm, but on the other hand, 20 years ago, Jim Abbott pitched.
Yep.
Jim Abbott pitched in the major leagues with one hand. So I mean,
pitched a no-hitter. Perfect game for the Yankees.
Exactly. So, I mean, it's not something that was unprecedented. I mean, he just happened to be the first one. But the fact is that he was able to play, and it wasn't that long, but he did play in the major leagues with one arm and was pretty effective. Although, pitchers eventually, they knew, how to pitch to him because with one arm, I mean, his range of batting style and his mobility was a lot limited. But on the other hand, he did play.
He's known as someone who was prickly, didn't get along well with his teammates. And I think David mentioned something about that once in a conversation on one of these shows. And can you elaborate on that?
Did I? I don't recall that. He might have been. Keep in mind, though, that he came up with the St. Louis Browns, which is was traditionally the worst team in Major League Baseball until they went to the World Series in 1944. But I don't recall his personality very much.
Oh, I thought I heard once that he wasn't getting along. He didn't get along with his teammates. Maybe his teammates resented him for his situation.
Well, I know, Ralph and David, I've heard that. I don't have any personal knowledge of it, but I've heard that he was a little bit, on the ornery side. I mean, maybe that was just his personality, or the fact that he was upset because at one time, he'd lost his arm in an accident as a kid. So, I mean, who knows how bitter he was, but I have heard that he was not the easiest guy to get along with.
Okay, so that stuck in the back of my mind somewhere.
But, the interesting thing, if you watch Jim, I don't remember seeing any movies of Pete Gray, but I'm sure he was similar to Jim Abbott in one respect. Jim Abbott had developed, and I think Jim Abbott was born that way, Jim Abbott developed a way of moving his glove from the one hand he had when he caught the ball to switching it to under his arm and tossing up the baseball, pushing the glove under his arm, and grabbing the baseball with his one good arm to pitch. And it was so fast that I defy anyone who watches a movie of this to see how he did it. I watched him pitch a number of games, and it was like an optical illusion.
It was
and of course,
a motion with two of his arms moving simultaneously. To put the glove back on.
He rested the glove on the stump arm.
Right.
And it was just so. Now, of course, Pete Gray wasn't a pitcher, so he didn't have to do all that. I think
Gray did a similar. David, I think Gray did something similar in the outfield when he caught a ball. I think he had to catch it, put the glove under his arm, and throw because he only had the one arm. So
right.
I think that was part of it. A very similar, and maybe that, who knows? Maybe Jim Abbott saw that happen one time and figured that was a way to do it, but that was Pete Gray's method of playing in the outfield. I have seen pictures of him, not in movies, not motion pictures, but in the outfield doing that. So I think you're absolutely right. That's what he did.
In fact, they made two movies about it. Keith Carradine reprised the role of Pete Gray in a movie in the 1980s. But I forget who played it. Yeah, I forget who played the original. Anyway, so it's a shame because Shepard really should have gotten
more
a movie.
Publicity.
Yeah.
What a hero to come back and how great it must have been for his head for the rest of his life to know that you can shoot my freaking leg off, but I'm going to come back and play Major League Baseball.
Yep. There were a number of ball players who actually played in the war for a very brief time. One of the most famous one was Al Gianfrido, who's known only for that great catch he made off Joe DiMaggio.
Back.
That's the one. Yep. Mm-hmm.
And in left field, he catches it, and you see DiMaggio getting to second base and kicking the dirt.
Right.
It was
exactly.
the only emotion I've ever seen
right.
baseball field. Ever seen, but ever recorded.
By DiMaggio, yeah. You and everyone else.
Yeah. He just kicked up that. Well, that was a.
That was a World Series game. And he didn't make the roster the next year. So that was his last Major League game.
Wow.
An interesting little trivia question.
Right, that's good.
Was he Puerto Rican? I'm just wondering.
Gianfrido?
No, he was Italian, obviously.
Yeah, he was Italian. Yeah.
There was a Puerto Rican guy that came up with the Dodgers, too, that had some sort of notoriety, and
I think it was Sandy Ambrose.
That could have been. Sandy Ambrose?
I think it was. Yep.
Oh, okay.
Ambrose. Yep.
Great.
I think. I mean, I'm not a broker. You know, next time we talk to Ronnie, he would probably know, but I think it was Sandy Ambrose.
Well, you are an aficionado of baseball history. Talk briefly. I want to give the audience an example of what I got here in George Case, and what an addition you're going to make to the radio show, the upcoming show. You were a big muckety muck with Saber. Now, I don't remember the exact title. Tell us about that. Tell us what Saber is, and give me an idea of that organization.
Well, Saber itself is actually a worldwide organization of baseball aficionados, and Saber stands for the Society for American Baseball Research, and I was hired back in, I think it was 2000, to become the executive director because of my baseball background and knowledge and that kind of thing, and I enjoyed it. I was there for a couple of years, and I was able to, get the organization going, and hopefully the increase in the membership is part of what I was able to do. But I brought a little bit of an inside knowledge of baseball. I wasn't a stats person, but I was a history person, so I knew about the game. I'd mentioned about Lou Gehrig and the ALS. I did some fundraising on behalf of Saber for ALS and did some speaking. So for me, it was a natural. I enjoyed it, and Saber's a current organization founded in Cooperstown, New York, I believe in 1973. And it is worldwide. They have chapters all over the United States and about 6 or 8 chapters in the rest of the world, England, Far East, I think Germany. And these are all people who really enjoy baseball and baseball history. So for me, it was sort of a natural fit, and I really enjoyed it.
Okay. Now, there's one thing about Saber that really intrigues me as a fan. A fan is offered the opportunity to write a bio about a ball player. Can you give me an idea what that's about?
Well, they do have a biography project, and as a matter of fact, I had one of the Saber members called me and said he was going to write an article, which is there. It's on the Saber website about my father, and he just wanted to verify some numbers and some reminiscences that I had. So, yes, there is a Saber biographical organization that does, write biographies of Major League ball players. And you just go on the Saber site, you put in whatever the name is, and if there's a biography on that player, it'll come up online, and you'll be able to read it. It's very interesting.
And conversely, if there isn't a biography, it's open. And it doesn't have to be a star. It can just be somebody who one fan is interested in,
right,
who wants to elaborate on the man's life, this, that, and the other thing.
No, Ralph, that's exactly right. There's a lot of players on there that maybe not household names, but people had an interest or knew him, and they could write a biography, and that's up to the individual. I mean, there's no money involved. It's strictly a labor of love. And if they want to write about somebody who's a good friend or somebody that they know as a major league player, they're welcome to do that.
Yeah, I think that's a terrific facet of the organization.
I have a question about that. Is it sort of like peer reviewed the way, how do you, if somebody writes an article, how does the organization know that?
Yeah, you know what, David, I can't tell you. I'm sure there is some kind of peer review, because I know that the fellow that wrote the article about my dad, he got information from me, and he had to cite me as the source. And then it had to be reviewed by somebody, because, the guy could have written a thing and said, hey, I talked to George Case. He thinks his father was a bum. I don't know. But the fact is that that's what they did. He called, was courteous to me, asked me about it, and then sent me the article with all the citations about quotes from me, letters from me, and that's how they did it, right.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yep.
Now, George, because Mickey Vernon was like an uncle to you, has his biography on Saber been written? And would you consider writing it if not?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would certainly consider it, but I think there was a book. Well, I know there's a book because I have it. It's called Mickey Vernon, the Gentleman First Baseman, which was written by Rich Westcott, who I think we had on with us a few months ago. And Rich might have written it. I'd have to look to see if there is a biography on Mickey, but I would think that there would be. But I would think if anybody, Rich would be the one to do it because he spent so much time, just like David did, in researching the books. I mean, that's part of what you do as a writer. You do the research.
Now, George, you helped David and in compiling that book, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, David was kind enough to ask me things, and I enjoyed it, just like Rich, asked me things about Mickey Vernon, which I remembered as being a child or my personal relationship, and the same thing with David. David was kind enough to ask me questions, and I provided him with some photographs and some background information, and I was happy to do it, and I'm really pleased that David's book has done so well, and I think it's now. David, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's now available in paperback, I believe.
Yes, it is. It actually came out in paperback at the start of last season with a special banner across the top because it marked the 70th anniversary of Jackie Robinson's debut in the major leagues. And the book ends with Robinson signing to Montreal.
Yeah.
I'm speaking for all three of us when I say this. 70 years, I can tell you that as being alive for all of those years, the time has absolutely flown by. Will you guys agree with me?
Oh,
I know I would. Absolutely.
I have proof. I was in Los Angeles. I think it was maybe my first time there, and there were banners up on the light post in downtown Los Angeles celebrating the 40th anniversary of the Dodgers moving to Los Angeles, and it just stopped me short. I said, 40 years? It can't be 40 years. And they were just there at Ebbets Field. It seemed more like spring training break than anything else. It was 40 years.
You know what, David, was funny, and Ralph, I had a guy called me a couple months ago. He had seen my father's picture up on the internet, and he called me up. He said, "Man, what was it like to have a grandfather who played baseball?" I said, "Sir, thank you very much, but that was my father," and he was like stunned.
That's terrific. That's terrific. Hey, you guys made a great show today. This is a promo, if you will, for the upcoming syndicated radio show called Comfortably Zoned in a Vat of Pine Tar. And it's going to be on Sports Byline USA. I'm excited. We get a chance to monetize what we've done for just love of the game. You guys have been doing it with me for the better part of 2 years, and I'm thrilled. Can't wait, and I thank you. I'm appreciative of your company and your friendship.
Wow.
Hey, thank you, guys. I really appreciate it. I'm looking forward to it. And David, Ralph, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And I got to run. I'm getting the high sign here. So anyhow, I really appreciate it very much. I always enjoy talking about this.
That high sign, I used to salute. Does that help?
Okay. I'm told I'm given the out sign. The out sign means either you come out the door now or you're out.
I know what that means too. I know what they all mean. I know what the looks mean. I know what the smiles mean.
There you go. I'll see you guys. Thank you.
We'll speak to you Tuesday, George. Bye-bye.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Be well, guys.
Okay.
Thanks for everybody for listening. We'll be back soon. Adios.